Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar covering conducting a threat hazard identification and risk assessment, also known as THIRA webinar. My name is Cynthia Arredondo, and I will serve as your host for this event. This morning, again, we are fortunate enough to have Laura Stone and Tom Kelly, who are both school safety specialists here at the Texas School Safety Center. Before we begin, as we've done with the other webinars, I'd like to go over a few basic ground rules. First one is that the chat feature is located at the bottom right corner of your screen. Should you have any questions during the webinar, please enter your question in the chat box. If we're able to address your question right away, we will do so. If not, we'll be able to address it at some point during the webinar. We certainly encourage you to take this time to ask any questions that you have of Tom and or Laura, and I'm pretty confident that they'll give you a good answer. As I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar as well. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to Ms. Laura Stone. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We have a couple of objectives and outcomes that I'd like to review quickly before we begin. First of all, we want to make sure that by the end of this webinar, you're able to recognize the importance of conducting a hazard and threat analysis. And then also being able to identify the 4 steps in the THIRA process.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking some time out of your busy schedules to talk to us about a THIRA, threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. As we know, Texas Education Code 37.108 requires that districts adopt and implement a multi-hazard emergency context, meaning that the EOP addresses any hazards that the district identifies as having a potential effect on operations. Written into Texas Education Code 37.108, it says that the EOP must address 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Therefore, each district must assess and identify their hazards and threats to know what you have to address within your EOP. The threat and hazard identification and risk assessment is such a tool that we can use for that purposes. So, tying this back to our entire EOP webinar series, making sure that the Texas Unified School Safety and Security Standards The Texas Unified School Safety and Security Standard are another tool that was developed by Texas schools, the Texas School Safety Center, and other key educational partners throughout Texas. These were all developed collaboratively. Standards are organized using those 4 phases of emergency management cycle as we said above. Standard 1.5 under mitigation/prevention, it introduces as a best practice the conduction of a THIRA. Standard 1.6 prompts school districts to utilize the results of that THIRA to develop their protective actions excuse me, and activities and plans as part of their emergency operations. Now, just to be clear about it, state statute does not require specifically that a THIRA be utilized, but it is considered a best practice to conduct an assessment to understand the hazards a district faces. And by following the 4 steps of a THIRA, the district can plan for all phases of emergency operations as in the emergency operations. Now, again, our previous versions of the standards stated that you conduct a hazard assessment. And so a THIRA is just a little bit of an extension of that hazard assessment so that you understand a little bit more about all your threats, not just listing them, but listing them, putting them in context, understanding the situation, and putting those into actions within your emergency operations. A THIRA provides for the identification of hazards and threats while also analyzing the risk for a clearer understanding of impact, context, targets, and resources of a school district. We've kind of tried to customize this a little bit to be a little more specific to school districts. The national preparedness goal reflects a whole community approach that focuses on the capabilities necessary to protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk to the nation. Again, we're customizing this a little bit more to be specifically for your school district and your community. This webinar is an overview of that THIRA process in the context of school district while remaining consistent with that preparedness. Now, as part of that 6-step planning process that we spoke about earlier when we were doing the overview, another webinar where we talked about the overview of the operations planning process, this fits under that step 2 of understanding the situation. We have to know what our hazards and threats are and assess that risk, and then making sure we prioritize that. So that's all part of our emergency operations planning. So when we're trying to talk about what is a THIRA, it's a 4-step common risk assessment process that helps the whole community understand its risk capability requirements. That's one of the big pieces to a THIRA that goes beyond just a traditional hazard assessment, is to really understand what your capability targets are, what your requirements are, what your resources. It goes a little further to make sure that you accomplish all those goals through your procedures as part of the planning of emergency operations. And again, I think I've mentioned it a couple times, but this application of THIRA focuses more on school district communities, as opposed to, you look at, when you get into the FEMA documents, you'll see a lot about cities, counties, states, and even national applications. So if you're talking about something in the scale of Hurricane Harvey, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people affected. We're working this back down to the size of your school district, because it's applicable in all size districts and all operations. Now, real quickly, the 4 steps of the THIRA process. The first one is identifying the threats and hazards of concern. That one may be fairly easy. We shouldn't take an assumption, though, that things haven't changed over time, or that all of your facilities and all of your campuses have exactly the same threats and hazards. They may vary a little bit. Give those threats and hazard context. We'll get into each of these a little bit more as we go. Establish your capability targets, and then applying those results. All right, I'm going to turn this over to, not yet, sorry. Okay, identifying threats and hazards. Step 1 of the process, where we're going to start listing our threats and hazards. So you're going to make a list of threats and hazards specific to your district. And I think it might help a little bit to put things into the context of what is a threat versus a hazard. I know that for many years I would hear all the time that they talk about hazards, threats, and vulnerabilities, but I don't know that everybody really had a common understanding of what some of those differences were. So just to give you a little bit of context in that regard, there are hazards around us all over the place. Actually, this nice tranquil picture of a river actually represents a hazard. That river would be considered a hazard, but it's in a harmless state. There's nothing going on that would really make it a threat to your life, unless you fell in the water and couldn't swim or something like that, which then would change it from that harmless state. But in this this picture, this is a hazard. Okay, it's not threatening to most people. Now, that same river, in a different situation where there's mass flooding involved, would change that from that harmless state to a harmful state. And then it becomes a threat to life and property and operations. So, I think it helps to make sure that you're always thinking about that we're surrounded by hazards all over the place. Everything could be turned into a threat. Another example might be a playground. Playgrounds have lots of hazards. There's a certain amount of risk involved for children around there playing, and that's one of the intriguing things for the kids. There is a little bit of a risk. They like that. So there are hazards there. We don't want those to turn into a threat and threaten their well-being for a long period of time. So if you have dangerous, unmaintained equipment, or, your surfacing material is not sufficient, glass or other types of things, then it ceases to become hazard because it's no longer in a harmless state, it's in a harmful state, and the chance of somebody being injured is greater. So that would be an example. Chemistry labs, the same kind of thing. Chemistry labs in your schools are full of hazards, but they're controlled. As long as they're controlled and it's still in a harmless state, it's not a problem. But when lack of good safety procedures, or ventilation, storage, or all those things change that into a threat. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to talk a little bit more about types of threats and hazards.
Okay. Continuing on, typically threats and hazards fall into 3 different categories: natural, technological, and human caused. So I'm just going to break these down for just a couple of minutes and go through your understanding of the 3 categories. The first category is natural, which is, okay, just a moment, we're having some sound issues. Okay, this time we're going to go ahead and continue. Thank you for your patience. Going back to threats and hazards, there are 3 categories, as I said previously. The first of which is natural. These are a potential incident resulting from acts of nature. You have some examples listed there on the slide. You have flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, wildfires. Those are just a few examples. Also, you could have avalanches, animal disease outbreaks, landslides, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and winter storms. Again, depending on your location, even in the state of Texas, there's a great variance there. Okay, second type is the technological threats and hazards. These are, a potential incident resulting from accidents or failures of systems or structures that are in place. Again, the examples on the right side of the slide, these include train derailments, chemical releases, airplane crashes, dam failures, power failures. Could also be a vehicle accident or a mine accident, radiological release, those type of incidents. Okay, and the third category is human caused. Obviously, a potential incident resulting from intentional actions. A lot of times these are referred to as just the intentional category because of the mindset behind them. But again, we're thinking explosive attacks, chemical or biological attacks, school violence, terrorism, and cyber incidents here. And one note that we want to make sure we point out regarding the 3 categories, they're not always confined to one category. It's certainly possible that you could have a combination category incident. For example, you could have a dam that breaks, but it is caused by someone who, intentionally creates the break with a bomb or an explosive. So there is such a thing as a combination of the categories depending on, the situation. So it's not specific to one all the time. Okay, also in thinking about our threats and our hazards as you're trying to identify and get a really good, strong core list of them for your district, there's a lot of really good resources online. One in particular on this slide we went into our Texas School Safety Center website, and we have a pipeline toolkit, and you can click on tools and find it in there. But within that pipeline toolkit, there's an active link for a site that'll allow you to search for pipelines in your area. And we all know that pipelines are, of course, the unseen, easily forgotten hazard. And there are certainly others as well, but this is an interesting one. I believe we pulled up in the Midland area on this one. All different levels you can pull up, but it is a really good resource to use to look and see what is actually coming through your area. And so this is, again, in the Pipeline Safety Kit toolkit online. There are other resources. You can go to Google Maps and do the aerial view, and certainly you can identify railroad tracks, local industries that are within proximity to any of your campus campuses or facilities in your district. Lots of really good resources. Also, the National Weather Service has a really good storm database, and I believe it goes way back several years. Let's say it goes back to 1953, but it is a good storm events database, and you can actually go to the National Weather Service website and just put in a search for that database, and you can pull up by county within specific dates and types of incidents, historical events for your community. So an excellent resource that's absolutely free and available for everybody. Let's see. A few other things when you're really trying to get your list of your threats and hazards. Again, consider the historical context, things that have happened historically in your district, in your community, in your county. Again, there are lots of community partners and emergency planners in your area and your locally that can help you research those. They already have those. The environment, consider specific environmental conditions that exist in your area. Population and demographics certainly will have a huge key role in your threats and hazard identifications. Are you in a very rural area or a very urban area? Certainly those are quite opposite as regarding threats. Local industry, as I mentioned with the Google Maps, depending on what industries are in your area. I know I grew up in East Texas, and I lived along a corridor that had a vast number of petrochemical plants. And so certainly that's a hazard and a threat that was unique to prevalent in the area that I lived in growing up. But again, Texas is vast. And so that's just one example, but lots of different industries that can certainly impact your community. And then finally, the local and regional capabilities. Reach out to your community partners and ask, what capabilities do we have, but what do they have? It's important not to make any assumptions. Don't assume that they have things that they may not have. But again, your community partners will have access to resources that you may need in an incident. Speaking a little bit more about your community partners, the whole preparedness goal is a shared responsibility. You've got to be able to list out and expand your threats and hazards thoroughly. That's the whole point of spending time doing the THIRA process, is to go through very thoroughly and assess your threat. So these individuals can really help you do that. Make sure that you are aware of, who these people are. Reach out before an incident and establish relationships with these individuals. They are there to help you. Equipment, supplies, human capital, local law enforcement, fire departments, emergency management, community groups, especially, CERT groups, American Red Cross, places like that. Don't hesitate, because a relationship established now will really smooth the effectiveness and efficiency of a response down the road. Tom's going to take over at this point.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Also, in relation to the community partners, I wanted to bring up a couple of things. One, also remember that Texas Education Code 37108 lists some different entities that your emergency operations plan is supposed to coordinate with. The Texas Department of State Health Services, fire departments, police departments, your local health department, a number of those different entities. I think there's a little difference between collaboration and coordination. I always think of collaboration as getting the different perspectives and talking through your plans and looking over those, so you make sure that you incorporate everyone's perspectives. Whereas coordination of plans, they actually have to fit together so that the plans themselves are not doing different things, that they all coordinate toward the same outcomes and the same goals. So remember the wording of 37108. Just like we've recently done after the shooting in Florida, there's been a lot of eyes focused on what schools are doing across the country, and everybody's reevaluating their plans. So looking at those things, making sure you collaborate and coordinate with other entities. One really great example is a short story that I ran across a district, fairly small rural district, and we were talking about their bomb threat plans. And so they said their plans involved that if they got a bomb threat, they would call the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office would bring out their bomb sniffing dog and look for a device. If they were to find a device, then they would call out the bomb squad. So that was theoretically in their plan. They had that written in. A couple months later, they had their first bomb threat, and they went to utilize that plan. Called the. They had the call. They weren't sure if it was a credible threat or not, but still took the actions in their plan. Called the sheriff's office, asked them to send out their bomb sniffing dog, only to find that the sheriff's office didn't have a bomb sniffing dog. So, that's a fairly rare piece for most small sheriff's offices around the state. Usually those are associated with bigger entities or even some military installations, but they don't always have those. So then they said, okay, we'll send out your bomb squad. Well, again, that's another one of those things that bomb squads are not usually born out of small communities. They're usually maybe an Air Force base or a military installation or a fairly big city. It may be your police department or your fire department. Oftentimes it's fire departments that have that responsibility. So the point of all this is if you are coordinating and collaborating your plans, you would know ahead of time that those are not resources that are available to your area. Maybe 2 or 3 hours before a bomb squad could actually arrive, depending on the distance they have to travel. So that would cut down on things a lot. So make sure in your coordination and collaboration you're doing that, and it'll lead to a lot better outcomes and planning. So step 2 of the THIRA gives the threats and hazards context. So it's not just sufficient to say, well, we might have a tornado, we may have a flood, we may have spring storms, all those kinds of things. You really need to look at each one of them and add context. Context descriptions outline the conditions, including the time and location under which a threat or hazard might occur. So, if you're thinking about tornadoes, and I always think of the spring because that's when we first start seeing tornadoes pop up. And the heating that goes on during the day oftentimes culminates in some kind of a storm later that evening. So, knowing the times of year, what wind direction they come from, what times they may occur in your school district. Oftentimes it's early evening or maybe even later in the evening, but it also occurs sometimes on very hot days when it heats up earlier. So it could happen right around your dismissal time at loading buses. So it's very, very important that you consider that. And like Laura said, you can look at some of the statistics from prior storms and information in your area to help kind of predict and prepare for what kinds of things could happen. Looking at your wind direction, if you had whether it's a hazmat spill or the tornado itself, oftentimes follows some of the wind directions. So you may want to have a windsock someplace, or remembering that almost every school has a windsock, and the fact that you have a flag and a flagpole. So knowing your normal wind directions and changes in wind directions can be important too. But the seasons, the time, your dismissal times, even the way your building is oriented on its site may have something to do with an outcome of a tornado. How you align your tornado safe areas to not be in the same direction that a tornado would normally hit. So you have to look at each of those different hazards and threats and figure out how it would affect your community. Railroad tracks through the middle of town may separate you from medical assistance. All sorts of issues like that. I think we think of a train derailment sometimes only in terms of a hazardous material spill, but oftentimes really just the train tipping over itself may stop you from having your transportation operations run normally. So, planning for all those things. One example of a very difficult situation was the tragedy and explosion at West, Texas. I think everybody knows that a couple of days ago was actually the 5th anniversary, April 17th of 2013 at 7:51 p.m. The fertilizer plant that was very close to the schools and community exploded. And again, the community kind of grew out toward the fertilizer plant, but in the pathway was a nursing home. Unfortunately, quite a few responders lost their lives. So, some of the impacts of that explosion were, first of all, of course, the loss of life and injury, and there were hundreds of people injured, and unfortunately lost a lot of responders and a few of the patrons from the community as well. But it affected nursing homes. It affected the economy for years, the facilities for years. Schools were not able to operate at all. That coordination that we talked about before, including memorandums of understanding and relationships with other districts, allowed the school district to work with Connolly ISD, and the two of them together put together a phenomenal way of continuing their operations. So they had a very good continuity of operations plan, and because of the relationships they had, those kids only missed a few days of school and were right back in to a very welcoming, good learning environment, participating in their education with Connolly ISD. So it was West Connolly or Connolly West. They worked together and embraced each other for a long period of time. And then there was a series of portables that were brought in after that. So a very good example of a whole community that could have totally been decimated by this, but because of the planning and the relationships and the coordination, they've come through this, very admirably. So as we think of it, that's probably one really good example of something that can occur we have to try to plan for. So when you're creating context descriptions, we're going to give you a few examples of a few different types of threats, and these are very broad, and yours are going to be more specific. It's a little harder for us to do it here without knowing the size of a particular district. We're looking at all sorts of different districts, but the threat and hazard here is we just use the threat of a tornado. So in this context description, it's an F3 tornado was indicated heading toward ABC Elementary School at 2:00 p.m., traveling at 30 miles per hour. Okay, it's pretty specific. It gives you a little bit of time frame, which it probably is a tornado warning, not a watch at this point in time. So that kind of puts things into context, and so you can start figuring out your resources and your steps based on this context description. Another example, a little less urgent, but still affecting the school, might be a threat of a water failure. Let's say you have a water main. At 1:30 p.m., a water main broke in front of XYZ Middle School, and all water to the school has been shut off. Well, immediately you have to think of what that means. It's 1:30 in the afternoon, start putting some context to it. All the water's gone, so what might that affect? So that's your context description there that'll get you started to identify impacts and some of your processes. Another one would be a bomb threat. At 10:00 a.m., Anywhere High School received a bomb threat by phone. Based on the information provided, the threat was deemed credible. Approximately 1,200 students and staff are in that facility. So, again, there's a little bit of a context. We've made an assumption in this case that the bomb threat was deemed credible. That may change your operations right there, just the fact that you felt it was a credible threat. So then we would move into identifying some of the impacts. In our first scenario, when we talked about the tornado, one of the things is you're probably going to immediately suspend your normal operations and then move everyone into, hopefully you have some pre-identified areas of campus, the safest place you have within your campus. This is something that gets overlooked oftentimes until all of a sudden you have a tornado. So hopefully you're identifying those areas, you're drilling them and practicing as if the tornado is real, and you're putting everybody in those positions. Don't just say, well, we're not going to move everybody from the second floor down to the first because that's a big hassle. No, you have to. You have to move all those people down, practice just the way they would in a real scenario so you can see how many people fit. Is this a good area or not? How far from exterior doors? All those kinds of things. If the building were to be impacted, you'd have to plan for what you're going to do for casualties, what kind of medical treatment you're going to give, what kind of property damage may be there. Any kind of situation could exist. Maybe it's a little bit of wind damage. Is it enough that you need to delay your release so that you're not releasing kids right at the time the tornado comes? Might you have to delay it long enough that you have to reunify later on and put the children back into contact with their appropriate family members? And then, facing your loss of operations for an undetermined period of time. So you'd have to identify those for each hazard and each threat within the context of your schools. Water failure, similar types of things. Limited or no use of the restrooms. You'd have to probably distribute some drinking water. Nobody gets as thirsty as they do the minute they find out they don't have anything to drink, and then all of a sudden they're very thirsty. Or you don't have to use the bathroom until you find out they don't work, and now all of a sudden everybody's got to use the restroom. So, those kind of things happen. But you may have to distribute that drinking water, possibly talk about early dismissal, maybe coordinating with your fire marshal. They may not want anybody in the building if there's no water to be able to fight a fire. So all those things affect your heating and air conditioning systems, your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. Some of them, a lot of them, require cooling towers, chilling towers that have water circulating through. So that may be affected too. And, thinking about if those things all fail, you may have to do a reunification. It may just be an early release, or maybe you can, kind of hold out through that day, seeing as we already looked at the time at 1:30. So that may be a possible impact. So these are just some ideas of some of the impacts from a particular scenario. I'm going to turn this back over to Laura now, who's going to take you through step 3. Oops, I didn't even go through the bomb threat yet. Okay, I'll take that back. I was trying to get out too early. And the bomb threat, same kind of thing. You'll probably end up ceasing your normal operations. You got to determine right away whether there's off-site evacuation or reunification necessary. Some bomb threats may be resolved fairly quickly, especially if you don't find them to be credible. But then again, you may have to do an off-site evacuation or something. You may have a reunification. And if you're reunifying in another school, you got to think of the impact to that school as well. You got crime scene preservation. You're going to have emotional support. You may have to have food service if this goes on into the evening. I know that some of the schools up in the Killeen area, Fort Hood, has had the base closed before because of a threat. All of a sudden, those schools that are on base, it may be many hours, so they have to start thinking about feeding them dinner and taking care of folks until they can do reunification. So you may have to have food service, and the impacts to responding agencies, especially if something's widespread. So again, that's a impact. So now I think we're ready to move on.
Step 3. That's right. Okay. So step 3 is establishing your capability targets. And in this step, you're going to assess each of the threats and hazards that you have in context, and you're going to develop goals and what you really want to accomplish through each of those. So first, obviously, what are capability targets? Well, they're best described as what you want to achieve in a particular area of preparedness. Okay? They need to be very specific and measurable. And in order to do this, you've got to consider those impacts. And then you've got to consider, what are your desired outcomes for that threat? What is it that you want to be able to do? You've got to include size, complexity, time frames, and of course the level of resources and efforts that are going to be required to carry those out. So again, we're going to go back to the 3 scenarios that we've been looking at. And we're going to establish just some sample capability targets within each of these. Again, you're going to have multiple targets. We're just generating one so that you can see an example of what might be something you would want to have as an outcome here. So going back to the tornado, upon notification, you would move all occupants of the affected facility, so 100%, into a designated tornado shelter within 15 minutes. So again, these are very specific and measurable goals or outcomes that you want. And you would have more than just one, but that would be one example, again, of a capability target for a tornado threat. Okay, looking at the water failure situation, in this incident, you might have the target of providing emergency water supplies to designated areas of the school within 1 hour and facilitate normal dismissal. Okay, obviously, you're going to need to bring in water. You may have already decided on your campus, in advance what areas you want to provide that water to. Obviously, there's huge variances here. Are we talking about a high school campus with, thousands of students? Are we talking about an elementary that only has 500? So really important that you think through that, and you will again have more than one capability target. Let's go back to the bomb threat scenario also. Possible capability target or goal would be to evacuate the building within 15 minutes and conduct an off-site evacuation of all occupants of the affected facility to a predetermined site within 2 hours. And again, we're just trying to make up a feasible example here, but if you really look at your student body and your staff population, you can fairly reasonably calculate the amount of transportation and the time frame that you can get all individuals out of that facility onto buses or whatever transportation means you have available, or possibly walk, whatever the situation requires to get to your offsite evacuation place. So again, these are things that you can very well sit down and come up with a measurable, specific capability target. Okay, so the fourth step in the THIRA process is applying those results. That's really a general statement. So basically, using everything that you've gathered so far, the capability targets that you just established for your threats in that step 3 that we just talked about, you're going to identify resources that you're going to need in order to meet those capability targets. And this means, what do we already have and what are we going to need? So communities complete this step again by estimating what resources you're going to need to manage this threat and hazard. Okay, and what do we mean by resource requirements? Well, resource requirements are lists of critical items, specific things that you're going to need in order to manage and resolve these threats and hazards that are of a concern to you and your district. So let's look at, again, our 3 scenarios. First, the tornado incident. Again, we're just throwing out example items. Your list would be certainly more than 3. But what resources are you going to need in order to successfully manage this incident? First of all, obviously a notification system. How will you make individuals and staff aware of the need to evacuate or to shelter in place, whatever your situation is at the time? And we put the number 1 because you want to be very specific here. This is your actual go-to list. All this upfront work is going to pay off if you have to use it one day. You have all these things already thought through in a very calm environment, and you're not having to put yourself in an emergency situation and trying to think through all these details. Another resource requirement would be a pre-designated tornado shelter area. You probably already have this, but it's a really a best practice to have your areas, your secure areas on your maps that are posted around your building. But be sure that you already have these designated areas planned out, and you've drilled them, you've practiced them, you know where they're going to be. How many are you going to need for an elementary of 500 or for a middle school of 1,200? You need to plan those out, and that goes through the whole preparedness cycle of planning and taking it out for a spin, train on it, exercise on it, and then you'll know for sure you can come back and revise your THIRA and make sure you have your resource requirements really accurately noted. Finally, emergency medical supplies. The specific medical needs of some of your students that are there on campus. You also know just general first aid supplies that are recommended. There's some great websites that list all kinds of American Red Cross kits and recommended items that should be in these kits. But your population, some general items that are recommended that need to be in those kits. So how many are you going to need? Again, you can reasonably calculate to a certain extent how many of those you're going to need. Looking at the water failure threat that we mentioned, here we have I think it's a middle school. So how much water are you going to need? You're going to bring it in, but how much are you going to need? You're going to request bottles. We put bottles down here. Notice we put question marks in here. You're obviously not going to put a question mark. You're sitting around the table calculating specific best estimate numbers to put in these blanks so that when this happens, if it happens, you can feasibly request up front exactly what you need. So again, you're not going to have question marks in yours, but bottled water, transportation. How is that water going to get to your site? And other supplies that you may need. I've actually been through this at an elementary pre-K through 4 campus. We needed water. We needed buckets to flush toilets. You do not want to tell a 3-year-old they cannot go to the bathroom. There's a lot of emotional support needed. But I'm saying that to say, think through, how are those supplies even going to get to your campus? Do you have another campus nearby that can help support that? Are they going to be stored in a warehouse on a district site or what? So how is that going to happen? How many transportation vehicles or means are you going to need? Very specific. The more specific, the better. And recycling containers was another resource that we thought would be appropriate. If you're bringing in thousands and thousands of bottles of water, you need to be able to dispose of those appropriately, environmentally appropriate. So, how many would that take? Where would you set those up? Are there any issues with the city for setting up those on a temporary basis on your site? Okay, and then the bomb threat scenario at the high school. Again, you're going to have a lot of resources listed here, but obviously a notification system, letting everyone know exactly what to do, what response action to take. What kind of law enforcement support will you need? We've listed a question mark, but again, we're thinking through just traffic control, trying to get an offsite. If it's credible, then you're doing an offsite evacuation. You need officers there, not specifically your school officers, although it can be. So you're going to need help controlling traffic so that those buses can get in and out quickly. You're going to have separate law enforcement officers on the scene. You need them to take care of the incident. Just to investigate the crime. You're also going to need security for sure. So all different types of law enforcement groups to think about there. Buses, again, how many students are you evacuating off site? You can reasonably calculate, if you can get 60 or 70 students on a bus, depending on size and age level, how many buses times how many trips are they going to make to the secondary site and back? You can calculate those things fairly reasonably. The reunification teams, when you do get everyone on site, how many individuals are you going to need to run your teams that are there helping out in different capacities? Your medical support, your nursing staff. It can include counselors, but again, staffing at that reunification site with medical is critical. We put the number 5. You may calculate that you don't need quite that many or twice as many. Reunification materials and kits, all of those things that you want, the information sheets you want parents to fill out. Again, how many of those are you going to need? Depends on your specific student population and size. Okay, so this is an example on the screen here of a completed THIRA. It's a sample, and it's out of a resource, a reference that I'm going to show you on another slide very soon. There is no mandated format for you to put a THIRA into. There's no magical box or table. But this is a good, simple, easy to read, very actionable type form that's in one of the FEMA's documents. So you obviously have the 2 threats. You have the earthquake and the terrorism at the top. Underneath it, they've added, and I'm not going to read it, but you can read their specific context description for both of those threats. Underneath there, so it gives you some really good kind of worst case scenario or a really reasonable scenario that could happen there. Then underneath that, you have your capability target. Remember, those are the goals, the outcomes that you want to have happen. And we talked about how specific and measurable those need to be. You're looking at some very specific ones there in the middle of the chart. Within 72 hours, we're going to rescue 5,000 people in 1,000 completely collapsed buildings. Now, again, when we think about FEMA examples, we're thinking on a much broader, grander scale. We're thinking about, statewide, a whole community of counties. So their examples are much more extensive. We're in this process today, we're just trying to give you examples that are very school district based. But this is, coming from FEMA again. But again, there's a very specific capability targets. And then finally at the bottom, you see the list of resource requirements down there. It's listed using a specific NIMS typed resource standardized system that FEMA has in place. if you're interested in that system, there's lots of information in the guide I'm going to show you in a second. But basically, we just want you to understand the importance and the value in sitting down beforehand and thinking through and calculating as best you can, what are we going to need if this happens? So these are typed resources at the bottom there, different types of task forces, different types of things that you would need there. And then they have a specific number that they're requesting based on the charts that are in the guide there. Really, the main focus of the THIRA that we really want you to be able to walk away with today is going through this process really forces you to look at what is it that we need to be prepared for. As a district, what threats are viable? What do we really need to be prepared for? Let's think through those. What resources, again, are we going to need if we think through that scenario? What are we going to have to be prepared? And then, who are we going to work with? What other resources beyond what we have are we going to be able to reach out to and have access to confidently? So it forces us to go through there and get answers and have a really good comprehensive plan. Okay, this is the resource that I was mentioning previously. The Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment Guide is a comprehensive preparedness guide, 201. There is a previous version. This one supersedes the 101, the second version that came out in 2013. And you can find this, the website right there on the slide for you, FEMA.gov. There's tons of resources. This guide walks you through all 4 of those steps in much greater detail than we did today. Again, when you think FEMA explaining, you're thinking nationwide, statewide examples and resources. And so you have to read that with that feather in the back of your mind thinking, okay, I've got to put this in a school perspective, the district perspective, but it is very thorough and can give you other detailed definitions and examples beyond what we gave you today. Also, once you complete the evaluation for this webinar, a link we will provide in the handouts that you have access to will be there so that you don't have to go online and find it. We'll provide that link for you in the handouts as well. Any other comments? Oh, yes, thank you. I did try to go online to training.fema.gov, and there is a THIRA course, and it is an independent study course. And it is currently being revised, unfortunately. But there is one, and when it comes out, I'm sure it's going to be a very detailed, thorough walkthrough of this guide that I'm showing you here. But again, it is Independent Study Course 2001. And once it is finalized and revised, it would be a really good resource for you to go through and kind of get some more information in detail about the topic that we're presenting today.
I wanted to mention one more thing real quick too. Don't forget that your community partners, your local emergency managers, your county emergency managers, and state officials as well are doing the same type of process. So you should be included as a school district. You should be you're a governmental entity. You're part of that whole community. So make sure that your voices are heard as well, and any opportunities you have to get with some of the mitigation planners in your area, any of those other resources, your local emergency management planning commission, or council, can help you with your parts of it, and also you can add some insight into theirs. So again, thinking about community resource and everything, you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. There's a lot of other entities out there doing some of the similar work. So just wanted you to be aware of that as well. I'm going to let CJ bring us home here.
All right, thank you, Tom and Laura, for the wonderful information. At this time, I'm going to ask you all submit your questions into the chat box and really take an opportunity here to have we're fortunate enough to have Tom and Laura's expertise available to us now. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box. As we receive the questions, one of the things that I also wanted to cover is at the end of the session, most likely by tomorrow, you should be sent an evaluation link. After you successfully complete the evaluation, we will be sending you a link to the resources, materials, handouts that Tom and Laura have prepared for this particular webinar. So again, feel free to enter any questions that you may have, and I know that Tom and Laura will be standing by for a few minutes.
Okay. While you're thinking about asking that question, let me give a little hint at next week's webinar. Don't know if you all are registered or not, but next week our topic is creating the basic plan, and we have a guest presenter, Mr. Boyce Wilson, will be presenting from Waco on this topic. So I'm sure he'll have a lot of really good information in depth to share with us next week. So we look forward to that topic next webinar. And also, of course, I'm going to leave this up, but Tom and I both are offering our emails and our direct phone lines. Please give us a call if you're thinking about this webinar over lunch today or tomorrow morning sometime and you have a question. It's not too late. Just pick up the phone or email us. We'll be glad to share some information with you or point you in the right direction to some information that you might need. So don't hesitate. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes in case there are any questions that are coming up. One final thought that I did want to share about the THIRA process is that it is ongoing. It is not a one-stop shop. Like all of your EOP plan, your process, it's something that you go back to and you update. You might have new threats or hazards that you want to add that have emerged in your community. Consider updating the context descriptions for changing demographic factors. Change is always the constant. So make sure that you have a plan in place to come back and revisit your THIRA and revise some of these portions. Your capability targets and levels certainly are things that you as your school grows, is your estimate of time or buses really going to be actionable? So again, making sure you go back in and revise and update the different components of the THIRA will make it effective at any point in time during the year that you're using it, so that you need it. So okay, we'll wait a couple more minutes for any questions. Okay, at this time, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us and listening in today's webinar. We hope you've learned some valuable things. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you again.